Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight, we're going to be going into the middle of nowhere to experience some truly terrifying tales. As a reminder, the Paranormal Scholar has a promotion on her documentary, In Search of the Dead. I really do recommend it. It's really, really, really good. And if you'd like to get 50% off, it's available this weekend, only this weekend, and the information is in the description on how to obtain that. Do check it out, it's really good, or at least see the trailer. I recommend it. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. This was in late November of 2012, and I was doing an install in a winery in North Carolina. It was a long day because we were working out of town, so we worked late to get it finished in one day. I started driving home around midnight and had about a 3-hour drive back home to Oakland. It's 1:30 in the morning. I'm outside of Stockton, and I see this girl standing on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. She's wearing a little white dress that ends about 3 inches above her knees and is barefoot. She has long black hair flowing down her shoulders, and she is just standing still as a statue. I looked at her as I drove by, but she didn't move. Didn't acknowledge my loud truck as it passed or anything. I was pretty freaked out because you always hear stories like this, and then she just appears in your vehicle with you. But that wasn't the case. She just stood there in the night. The thing that was most weird to me was that it was cold that night, in the low 40s, as well as drizzling a fair bit. And she was wearing a short dress and had no shoes standing on the asphalt. If this was just some girl who does this for fun to freak people out, I feel like she would have been extremely cold and would have been shivering. But this girl did not move. Now, after I got home, I was thinking about it, and I searched "Ghost Girl outside of Stockton," and I found a bunch of articles and stories about the East 8 Mile Road Ghost Girl, and most of the descriptions fit what I saw to a T. I never went back to the area because I moved to another state shortly after, but I want to travel back there to see what I can find one day. Has anyone else seen this girl in that area? Or has anyone else seen a ghost girl in general on the side of a road like this one? Any info would be appreciated. This story happened to my sister-in-law 4 years ago. They are uber religious, and the state of her mental stability, on top of a finger found and a police follow-up, makes this story 100% true and searchable. Last July, my sister-in-law Jackie was going back to Boise to visit for the weekend. Her husband lives in Provo and is going to law school there, as he's just graduated from a BYU chapter somewhere in southern Idaho. I'm not from Idaho, and I'm not Mormon, so I don't remember where it's located. Anyway, Jackie decided to drive from Provo, Utah, and head up to BYU to say hello to her friends just before coming back to Boise. The route she was on was I-15, which forks off into I-84 up to Boise. After you pass through Salt Lake City, the route becomes lost in a plain rolling flat of miscellaneous desert dotted by farmland here and there. Jackie left Provo, Utah in the evening, as she planned on making dinner for her husband before her departure. She ended up leaving around 11 p.m. and given the late time, she decided to forego visiting her friends at the BYU chapter and headed along I-84 to come straight to Boise. She was in between Tremonton, Utah, and Burley, Idaho, in the literal middle of nowhere, where she drove up to what looked like a body lying in the road. The location is so desolate, there are no radio channels, cell phone services, or lights to be seen for hours. This 24-year-old girl was in the middle of the desert, in a green Dodge car that already had enough problems, so it's a miracle she made it home to us without issue to begin with. She arrived at my wife's parents' house, but that was just the beginning of the story, really. Here is her account of what led to these events. At 2 a.m., she said she saw something lying on the road in the distance. As she approached it, she could see it was a body, lifeless, in the middle of nowhere. It stretched across both lanes, and she could not simply pass without running it over. Cautiously, she came to a stop and made sure she parked about 15 yards away and stopped. She opened the door and yelled, "Are you all right?" But no response could be heard. With the car lights broadcasting brightly on the body in the road, she got out of her car and slowly walked towards the person. As she got about 10 feet from the body in the road, she could see it was a dummy, fully dressed in human clothes, just lying there. Terrified, she sprinted back to her car, slammed on the door, and sped over the dummy. We received the cell phone call from her around Mountain Home, 45 minutes away from Boise. She was shaken and terribly scared, claiming she could hear footsteps chasing her to her car before she got in and drove off. We wrote it off as a freak accident, as we were all asleep and sounded too bizarre to worry of anything. As she pulled into the subdivision, she called us once again to help her unload the car and, probably, console given the bizarre experience. I opened the garage door and stood in the driveway with my wife, waiting for her to pull in. She came racing into the driveway and jumped out of the car, and this is where I lost it. As she opened the car door, a finger fell out. She had not stopped and drove straight to us after she came across the dummy. The person who had placed the dummy had chased her back to her car, and as she slammed the door and sped off, the person had reached out, losing a finger in the slammed door. We immediately called the police in the area, where she said she stopped at. The cops did a survey of all the hospitals in the area for a man missing a finger, and they found an exact match of his description. He was still in the hospital as he was arrested. The police did not give any details into the man's past or who he was, just simply told us to not worry about him, as he'd been arrested. I'm sure it's an anticlimactic ending to a terrifying scenario, but I will never forget the feeling that came over me when the finger fell out of her car door. I always drive with a firearm in my vehicle now, any time I need to travel. We live in New Jersey, and if you're familiar with the magazine Weird and J, then you'll know all about Clinton Road. For those of you who don't, Clinton Road is a road in West Milford, New Jersey, that's 10 miles of pure dark and winding of road in the middle of the woods, with no streetlights and no houses the entire way. It's considered the most haunted road in America and is a popular spot for teens and young adults to look for a scare. Popular urban legends of the area are ghosts, satanic rituals, and KKK gatherings in the woods, hybrid animals, and a spot where mafia hitman Richard Iceman Kuklinski would dump his bodies. So my friend and I took a trip there one time, and he's driving down the road and he swears he saw a fat guy with his face covered in face paint or makeup in his underwear, walking on the side of the road. Another time he said he found a red phone booth just like the ones in Britain, if not an exact replica, with an ominous purple or dark blue light shining from it. About a year ago, I was out back with my family. It was around 8, and the sun was setting. We lived in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The closest neighbor lived far away, and something down the field kept catching my eye, but I ignored it at first. My sister saw it too, and kept looking out towards the trees. She was getting freaked out about it. My mum said to go investigate, so me and my sister started to walk across the field towards the tree line. Big mistake. It's hard for me to describe. This was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. I didn't see it at first, and I didn't understand why my sister was so scared, until we were about 100 yards away, when I saw this creature. Tall, probably 8 to 9 feet tall, white, humanoid with an elongated head, and no face. It had long arms and peeked around the trees. We stopped in our tracks. We couldn't tell what it was. It took a few steps further out of the trees and swayed back and forth, looking at me like a praying mantis. Me and my sister ran screaming back to the house, where my mum stood, jaw dropped. She'd seen it too. I had never been so scared in my life. We grabbed the binoculars and watched this terrifying creature peek in and out of the tree line, spying on us. My grandma thought we all had a wild imagination. The sun was almost gone now, and it was getting really dark, and the darker it got, the more it moved, back and forth along the trees. It was terrifying. So we went in for the night and locked everything up tight. I couldn't sleep that night. I was hearing scratching on the roof, and at one point, a very loud bang, and various noises coming from the barn. I was very afraid that I would wake up to my animals missing. The next morning, my grandma asked if we had heard the loud bangs outside that night. She ended up taking my grandpa with her on her morning walk. I have no idea what it was, and it still haunts me to this day. About 15 years ago, my parents, my brother and I were driving around the countryside looking for a way back to the highway after going to see a house outside of the city. The vegetation is mostly tall grass and dead trees, and the dirt road isn't lit at all, which at night gives the surroundings a kind of eerie feeling. My dad's Nissan Primera, it's making his way through the countless deserted crossroads, and we are lost as hell because there was no GPS back then. As we are arriving at another crossroads, we see there's something in the middle of the road. It looks like a baby carriage. As we get closer, my father slows down on the side of the carriage, and my mother starts shouting. There in the middle of the road is a beat-up baby carriage on its side, and we can hear a baby crying. My mum is going, "My God, the baby, get the baby!" And as she goes to open her door, my dad punches in gear and does one of those movie moves where the car slides a bit and does a gravel kick. He basically wants to haul us out of there. My mother is still crying and screaming, her door half open, and my brother and I look back just in time to see 4 guys jump out the tall grass on the side of the road, holding planks and baseball bats and other weapons. We eventually find our way to the highway and stop at a gas station right at the entrance. My father tells the gas station attendant what we just saw, and the dude goes, "Oh yeah, those guys. They're always doing that to steal cars and money. They basically put a baby doll in a carriage, and when you stop the car, they jump out the bushes and jack you for all you've got." We never went back to that region after that. My family and I have been hunting the same property in East Texas for over 10 years, and we've had some really creepy encounters with one of the locals. The property we hunt on is timber company land. It's way off the beaten path down some dirt roads. No power, no running water, no sewer. There are very few people that live in the area. Only a few scattered hunting camps and some locals. Our closest neighbors live in a trailer about a mile away, who we've come to call the meth house. Now, I'm not sure if there really is any meth going on there, but it would be hard to believe there isn't. This place has always been odd. There is a trailer sitting in the middle of a pine clearing. The brush is fairly overgrown around the trailer, almost as if the property is abandoned. There have always been broken down cars and other junk strewn throughout the front. Cow skulls and hip bones are attached to a pine tree in front of the house, going up about 15 to 20 feet. It started out with maybe 10, and over the years has grown to about 20. For a long time, I thought that was the oddest thing about the place. 2017, things started to get weirder. The front yard collection began to grow. A rotted out taxidermy of a wild hog was added to the skull tree. A doll head was fixed with horns and some kind of gown and mounted on a stick by the side of the dirt road that we called the baby devil. Tripods standing about 12 feet high. Each were erected around the trailer made out of young pine tree trunks. One day we drove by and noticed that from these tripods hung the spinal column and rib cages of some animals. We originally thought that maybe they were using the tripods to hang and clean deer, but the same bones hung for over a year, and someone would usually want to dispose of the leftover carcass because the smell can get overwhelmingly fierce very quickly. So, we had no encounters with the residents and weren't even sure what they looked like. The place was creepy, but they kept to themselves until later in the season, where we had 2 separate creepy encounters. The first happened to a good friend. He had made a quick day trip with his wife up to the property to fill feeders and ride 4-wheelers. To get to his spot, he had to go on the dirt road and drive right past the meth house. His spot is only a few hundred yards away from the house. While they were doing their thing, they began to hear some strange noises. As he listened closer, he could hear fast, high-pitched gibberish back and forth between 2 voices. He described it as a lot of yips, yas, and yees, and the word Jesus mixed in. They decided to get on one of the 4-wheelers and investigate. They found 2 men squatted down, picture Gollum Lord of the Rings style, besides a large mud puddle in front of the house. They were splashing and bouncing around while furious and loudly speaking gibberish. Once they noticed the 4-wheelers, they in unison stopped talking and stared like an animal that has been spooked. My buddy took off on the 4-wheeler and didn't look back. The second semi-encounter happened to me and my brother. We were up there alone for this weekend and were relaxing by the fire on a pitch-black night after a long day's hunt. We began to hear something strange off in the distance. It was pipe organ music. There were missed notes and sporadic stops and starts. We laughed about how this seems like the setup in a horror movie and tried to ignore it. The music continued on and off for the next few hours. Then all of a sudden we hear crashing through the brush. This was very thick brush, about 10 feet high and 100 feet or so deep, in between our camp and the direction of the house. This didn't sound like the usual spooked deer, armadillo rooting around, or hogs coming down the trail. It was a crash made by something large, and it was close. The rest of the night was quiet. No more organ music and no more noises in the woods. Likely, just a local little old lady practicing her organ for Sunday service the next morning, drifting over for another property. Likely it was some animal that got spooked crashing through the brush, but we sure were freaked. We made a point to not be alone overnight ever again, and kept a close eye on that house from now on. This story happened when I was working the 150-mile line between Nashville and Chattanooga, Tennessee. I was working a local job on that run called the Coan Pusher, with the mountain grade starting at Coan, basically going all the way down to Chattanooga. It can be a very difficult stretch of railroad. I had the third shift on the Cowan Pusher. It was all I could hold even if I didn't enjoy working nights. We basically just sat in the shop and waited to be called to help tonnage trains get to Sherwood, Tennessee. Now, all I can say about Sherwood is picture the hills have eyes with banjos added in. On the night in question, it was around 11:50 p.m. when a heavy freight train stopped over at Sherwood and requested our help to get over the other side of the mountain. We climbed on the engines and got on our way. By the time we hit Coan and started curving up the foot of the mountain, we had no visibility of anything that wasn't illuminated by the locomotive light. We had a 30-minute ride ahead of us, along with a 2-mile long dark tunnel in our path. As the clock struck midnight, we were now in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods filled with wolves, rattlesnakes, and a few mountain folk. Most of the mountain folk are nice, but don't let the sun set your ass in those woods. About 10 minutes later, the north portal of the tunnel was in sight. A bridge hung over the entrance. A branch line that was taken up long ago crossed it, going to another part of the mountains. The bridge is still accessible by ATV. As I looked up, I saw a campfire and people. They all looked to be dressed darkly, perhaps even in mask, and all I could see were their white faces. As we started under the bridge, we heard a thud over our heads on the locomotive roof. We proceeded through the dark tunnel and slowed just out of the south portal as the conductor looked out the back door with his flashlight. He saw nothing, so we shrugged our shoulders and proceeded on the last 10 minutes on our waiting train. It was 12:20 a.m., and we coupled on the rear of the train to push it from Sherwood. As the engineer on the head end entered the south portal of the tunnel, he radioed back to me talking about figures standing over the tunnel entrance. However, no one was there as it came in my sight. As we exited the north portal, I looked to the best I could to see on my side of the tracks for whatever had hit our roof. I saw what looked like a black cloak fluttering in the wind as we passed, but couldn't really tell. As we entered Coan, we uncoupled on the fly, and the train continued to Nashville. We cruised on into our parking track and tied our engines down. As we got off, we had the feeling of being watched, but thought nothing as we parked our asses in the office chairs. We had no more work for the rest of our shift. We just talked and napped on and off until 3 a.m. We never did shake the feeling of being watched, so we stepped outside as I put a pinch of dip in my lip, and my conductor lit a cigarette. As we both laughed with each other, we noticed movement in the brush across the tracks. Now I must remind you that both my conductor and myself are big country boys who don't scare easy. We went over to investigate. We found 3 hooded men in the bushes with a huge spot of my tobacco. I asked them, "What are you doing here? You understand you're trespassing on railroad property, right?" The lead guy then spoke up in a demonic, gravelly tone. "We just want what's ours." As he said this, he motioned to the top of the locomotive. We looked to see a young man on the roof at the air horn. The young man was in nothing, not even underwear. And as we all looked at him, he bolted from the roof, climbed off and ran down the tracks. As this happened, the figures turned to chase. The lead guy then turns his head back towards us with glowing eyes that we could now see. He hustled, stared at us, and gave chase with his friends. We called the cops, and after hours of investigation, they found the man's underwear, with no traces of him or the cloaked individuals. We even took them up the mountains. Cops love free train rides. There was nothing. Now on occasion we find dead animals by the shop door or locomotive, mutilated. I've even found 1 or 2 at my door at home. We still occasionally see that same fire on the bridge and get the feeling of being watched, but it's all gone by the time we return. I'm sure there's a cult somewhere on that mountain. Back in 2001, I was 21, working in a hotel bar 10 miles from my home. This was on Christmas Eve. I had to work that night. The hotel was open and I was the new kid on the job, so I had to. I closed the bar at 2 a.m., went to change my clothes, and went to my motorcycle. It was really cold at the time, so sometimes I would take a very narrow country road that cutted my trip almost to half, which was only used by residents of a few houses. I used it as I could exit near the main road on the motorcycle. A car could not. It was me and my friend from work on the motorcycle, and after maybe a mile in said road, in the middle of nowhere, near one of the houses, I saw something when passing by the house gate. I then stopped maybe 60 to 80 feet from the house gate. We both looked back, and there it was, like straight out of a movie. The typical Hollywood alien. It looked 6.5 to 7 feet tall, with grey skin, the oval face, the dark eyes, the complete package. We stared at it for 10 seconds, and it stared back at us. Then I proceeded to get the hell out of there. We both agreed to ourselves that it was just an idiot in a costume. For the next few years, I told this story to some close friends and family, just like I'm telling you now. We then went to separate jobs, but would occasionally see my friends, and we would always share a laugh about it. But we would always say, "What the hell was a guy doing in an alien costume at 2 a.m. on Christmas in the middle of nowhere, in those pitch black woods?" Now I'm 36 years old, and I'm a science kind of guy. I do believe that we are not alone, but I find it hard to believe 99% of the stuff we read. I would still like to think it was just an idiot in a costume, but I will forever think, what the hell? This happened about 26 years ago. My friend Jack and I were driving an RV, pulling an old truck bed conversion trailer to Yucca Valley. He made a deal with a friend of ours to trade his RV for a running truck. We were driving on Old Highway 247, where there was nothing, just flat sand and an occasional rock formation. I remember we passed a rolling sandhill overlooking winding roads of nothing, and it was dark. I was laying on the side couch taking a nap, while he called out for me to come up front and look at what he was seeing. They looked like lit balls of red fire darting past each other, going up and down about a mile ahead of us, and they seemed to be coming in our direction. As they got closer, we noticed that about 4 of them bunched together making one. Then 4 more joined them. Jack slowed down, and we were hoping they would go away, but they didn't. I opened the window, but we never heard a sound, and they just seemed to hover. Jack thought screw it, and started driving faster. That's when they all dispersed and flew towards this rock hill, and Jack floored it. We were all freaked out. As we were driving, we heard a bang from the back of the RV, so we ran back there trying to keep our balance because Jack was driving like a bat out of hell. And when I looked out the back window, I saw the trailer with something sparkling in the middle of it. I turned my head to tell him, but by the time I turned back, there were flames right where the sparks were. At the time, the red lights were gone, just gone. Jack pulled over, grabbed the small fire extinguisher by the stove, and we stood by the door, but we were too scared to go outside. With a few exhales, he puffed up his chest, swung open the door, and ran out the trailer. I had a big flashlight, and I trailed behind him. The flames were getting pretty big, lighting up the desert around us, and it took a while to put it out, as we were looking above and around us. Jack jumped in the trailer to see what had caught fire, but all he found was shards of pointed metallic pieces strewn around in a dent in the bottom of the trailer bed. I jumped at the trailer because I didn't want to be standing on the ground alone. Just then we heard something about 40 feet behind us on the passenger side. I shined my light, but we didn't see anything. It was quiet, not a car or light in sight. We heard it again. It sounded like gravel, like when you scrape your shoe on dry dirt, but it was closer. Jack thought he saw something, so he took the flashlight. I, of course, was holding onto him so close I could feel his heart thump through his ribs. He turned the light on, where we heard the noise, and it looked like around 5 piles of sand, like little mounds in a row. Then the noise stopped. We started to jump out the trailer, and we heard it again. Jack beamed the light and caught the flash of some reflective diamond-shaped eyes that quickly disappeared. Then those sandy dirt mounds began moving towards us at the same time, as if something small was pushing them from behind. Jack grabbed me. We jumped and ran towards the RV doors, and I don't think either of us had ever run that fast before. He put the RV in drive and we sped off. We heard things hitting the back like rocks being thrown, but we didn't falter. We were constantly looking around, and I stayed right next to him. By the time we got to a small town, the RV was sputtering. Jack didn't understand why. It was in perfect shape before we left, so we pulled over to check the engine, and under a streetlight, he took a walk around and saw that the hot tailplate had been curled up, like folded up facing the back of the bumper. When he looked up, he saw all of the back window screens were shredded, and the rubber around the glass was hanging. He took some tools and some gloves and straightened the pipe, and we drove a bit longer to our friend's house. We told our friend what happened, but he didn't believe us. The next day when we woke up, our friend came in asking what the hell we did to the RV. So when we looked at it, it looked like the glass was etched with scratches up where the screens were shredded. We had no explanation as to what could have cut glass like that, and there were dents on the top and the back. In one spot on the side, there was what looked like an impression of 5 fingers with nail holes at the end of them and a wide thumb. Needless to say, Jack had to pay our friend for the damage to the RV, and we took his new truck and drove the long way back home, and we never spoke about it to anyone again. He kept a few of those metallic shards. He said that when he held them it felt soft, but when he accidentally dropped it, it turned sharp and hard again. He told me that he had to get rid of them because the more he handled them, the more he noticed his hands would start to blister, and he didn't want his kids to get a hold of it. I kick myself now, because if I had known back then it was so significant, I would have asked him to let me keep them. 5 years ago it was daytime, and I was driving with my son in my small truck. We were following my ex in his car, and we ended up in that same spot. It didn't dawn on me that we were going that way. I started to hyperventilate, and my son had to calm me down. You see, it was times like this that really made me hate the desert. A few years back, my girlfriend at the time and I were on a week-long motorcycle trip during the summer, hotel hopping. We stopped in a major ski resort town, which is a complete ghost town during its off-season, for one of our stays, because close by there were multiple hiking attractions, one of them being a major ski resort itself. During the summer you can ride the lift to the top of the mountain, and from there supposedly take a 20-minute hike that overlooks the entire valley. We never got there. We arrive at this practically abandoned looking ski lodge, maybe had 6 cars in the parking lot if that, and no one was there to greet us as we walked in. We kind of aimlessly walked around the lodge and finally hear someone talking outside the chairlift. I approached the guy and asked about this hike that was offered. He was a seemingly nice man, told us the directions once at the top to walk straight back where you get off at, and there's a trail that bends to the left and follow it for 15 to 20 minutes. It's an easy walk and you see the whole valley at an overlook at the end. I gave him the $10 or whatever the cost was to ride the lift, and this is where it gets creepy. As we get to the top, the guy manning the console steps out and gives us a friendly wave. Kind of a young, hefty guy. He stops the lift, and I immediately notice he must have had some severe social anxiety, or was very intimidated by me, as I'm 6'2", 250 pounds, tattooed and sleeveless, wearing my leather riding vest. I'm used to people avoiding interactions with me. After stopping the chairlift, the guy turns back to me and just loses all color in his face like he's looking at the devil himself. He's so nervous he could hardly open the safety bar, so I pop it off and we hop off. I ask him about the trail and he manages to squeak out, "Over there." He points directly in front of us, and then he giggles. He giggled like a kid sneaking candy in the backseat of a car. As weird as it was, I took it as nervous laughter, and out of curiosity for his instant change of personality. I drag my feet around the lift house and take in the view for a while, trying to talk to this guy. I ask him a few questions, just being friendly to show him that I mean him no harm, but he never bites for conversation and shoots back quick, short answers. We go onto the trail, hike for almost an hour, never seeing anything but woods, and we never made it to the outlook, but came to a clearing in a field surrounded with more trees and no more trail. Total bad vibe. We almost jogged back the way we came. We came out of the woods, and the same guy from earlier acts completely shocked we came back, almost like we weren't supposed to return. He asked us a bunch of questions about the trail, all while lightly giggling after each sentence. Then it seemed as if he was going to be in some sort of trouble and hurried us into the chairlift back down the mountain. I'm an avid hiker. This trail only has one entrance and one exit, and we walked it from end to end. And Giggle Monster seemed surprised to hear we came back to a clearing like he's never known about it. The guys at the bottom of the mountain acted just as surprised. Maybe the body van was running late. I don't know. But that place had a wrong turn vibe all over it. I'm originally from the Gulf Coast of Texas, and when I was a kid growing up there, it was very easy to go from the bustling bright lights of Houston to the dark, deserted country road in only a few minutes. Not so much the case now, but ask anyone who's been far out in the country, away from any city or town, and they'll tell you that it gets dark out there. You can see the Milky Way in all its glory, but unless the moon is full and bright, you can't see your hands in front of your face. When driving, all you can see is the area illuminated by your headlights. Everything else is swallowed by the gloom. My father's family is scattered around the Gulf Coast, including cousins that lived far out in the middle of nowhere. One night, my parents, my brother, and my 8-year-old self were returning from a visit from one of those cousins just a few days after Halloween of 1988. My brother and I were in the back seat, quietly talking about a show that we'd watched once trick-or-treating had been over with. The show had talked about a shape-shifting ghost that liked to take the form of oncoming headlights that never passed. And my brother and I were talking about how weird and creepy it would be to see something like that. Our dad then mentioned that he had seen those before, and that in the back roads of Texas were a hotbed of paranormal activity. No sooner had the words left his mouth, a mile or so ahead of us, a pair of headlights appeared facing us. None of us thought anything of it, other than to laugh at the coincidence. It was nothing unusual to encounter another car or two at all hours of the night in such areas. We kept driving down the road, and with the four of us talking about various things, until my brother noticed the headlights, which were still facing us and had not gotten any closer. Cue the sudden, total silence inside our family car, as we all stared at the headlights. We kept going down this completely dark, otherwise empty road, and those lights stayed the same distance away from us, never getting any closer and never changing directions. I don't know how long we stared at them, but eventually, my brother and I began to get a little freaked out, and we ducked down out of sight behind the front seats. Not too long after that, Dad turned off that road and floored it, and the rest of the drive home was made in total silence. I never saw anything like that again, even though we traveled up and down that road on many occasions after that. And a couple of years later, we ended up moving to Illinois to be closer to my mother's family. And while the back roads of Illinois can be creepy, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget seeing those headlights keeping pace with us right after we discussed that very thing. My sister is a very short and petite girl, and her fiancé, a 6-foot guy who weighs more than 200 pounds, decided to do a little vacation type thing and rented a trailer out in the middle of nowhere. Sometime during their time there, This was around 1 or 2 a.m. They got into a bad fight, and he stormed off to another part of the trailer, and my sister was left feeling frustrated. All of a sudden, she felt eerily calm, and then she said she got an image in her head of this clearing with rocks, and despite never having been there, she felt drawn to it and seemed to know how to get there, like something wanted her to go there. So she put on her shoes and her fiancé came out and asked her where she was going. She said she was going on a walk and then left. She told me she got about 50 yards from the trailer before she was hit with this extreme and heavy dread and fear, and felt that if she went any further she would die, but felt like she couldn't panic and run. So she tried her best to act calm and went back to the trailer, walked inside, closed and locked the door behind her. And before her fiancé had a chance to ask what happened, they both heard something fast, way too fast and heavy, run from the forest and towards the trailer. It ran all around and over the trailer before they heard it come up the steps to the door and stop. Her fiancé grabbed a knife and was going to confront whatever it was, but she begged him not to and told him there was nothing he could do to hurt it. So they didn't. She didn't get any sleep that night, and when daylight came, nothing was out there. The scariest thing she said was that they never heard it, whatever it was, leave. I live in Pennsylvania and have heard and found so many scary and creepy stories in this state. I'm not originally from here, and it also creeped me out to learn that Dave Politis said the entire state of Pennsylvania is a cluster. I live in the woods. There are a lot of beautiful woods here in Pennsylvania, and the seasons are so nice, especially the beautiful fall colors. Like I said, I do live in the woods, and some creepy things happen here. I live on a very high cliff, and below are huge boulders, small caves, a creek, and miles of woods. It's beautiful and peaceful, yet sometimes creepy. I have a motion sensor light on the side near the cliff, and in the evening while doing the dishes or cooking, that light goes on and off an unusual amount of times. I always look out the window, but can never see what's setting it off. Of course, it could be bats the majority of the time. However, I have a German Shepherd, and at least a few times a month, she needs to go out to do her business, or she may hear something that she needs to investigate. Like most GSDs, she's very protective and guards very well. Sometimes I'll open the door and she will look out, then her hairs will stand up along her haunches and spine, and she will back up and refuse to go outside. This is really creepy, especially if it's one of those evenings when that motion sensor light comes on a high number of times. This dog is very brave and extremely protective. She has never acted afraid of any person or animal. She has one focus: to kill what comes in her yard or near her family. So when she does this thing, I tell you it scares me. And I certainly don't want to know what is scaring her. If anyone's dogs do this, I'd love to know. I've never had a dog do this before. Could it just be a smell? She's been sprayed by skunks and isn't afraid of smells as far as I'm aware. I'd appreciate anyone's input. I grew up on a property that connected to a game preserve, so my brothers and I practically ran wild in them constantly. Over the years, there were many times I felt there was something bad in the woods. Not all the time, but more at night. And not even every night. We also had an outhouse, so I'd have to go out in them at night more than your average kid. Flash forward to being 14, 15, and deciding to go get some plants to make a terrarium. We walked back the public dirt lane not far from the house and still touching our property, a place I walked with the dogs all the time, and went maybe 40 feet up the bank into our part of the woods. It's a gorgeous spring day, the sun is shining and everything is beautiful, and I realize I don't hear any birds, no squirrels, absolutely nothing. Then I hear a rhythmic tapping noise coming from further up in the woods. I figured it was a woodpecker, and I kept looking for plants, but it keeps making noise only when I walk and fall silent when I do. It keeps getting closer and starts walking to rustle leaves, waiting for this darn bird to appear. The noise finally gets close enough that I should see this devious woodpecker who doesn't sound entirely like a woodpecker anymore. There's nothing, yet it keeps coming closer and closer, making what now sounds like someone slapping their thighs in rhythm. Now it's gotten even closer, and I realize whatever it is has been messing with me the entire time to get closer, and I have that moment that makes my insides feel like they've been melted, and I'm about to crap myself, because that is dread, because there's something bad almost on me, and I flew through the woods and threw myself off the edge of the 6-foot bank straight out of the road. How I knew I'd be safe in the road, I don't know. I just felt like a boundary it wouldn't go on in my gut. It did follow me along the road for 20 feet into the woods till I came within line of sight of my house. I didn't tell anyone for years because I felt silly. And then one night I told my mum and little brother. He just looked at me and said, "Why do you think I stopped going back there? It followed me once from the other side of the road." Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's horrors. Does anyone want to take a road trip to the desert? I certainly think not after hearing that. If you did enjoy the video, you know what to do. As always, a huge thank you to my incredible patrons for supporting the channel. For as little as $1 a month, you can help keep everything running over here. It certainly means a lot, and you get some funky prizes to go along with it, so why not check it out? If there's a story that you would like to share of something that might have happened to you, you can find all the information in the description also. So without further ado, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.